Hi everybody, I'm Joey Parrish. I'm the team lead for Shaka Player, and today we're talking about a practical premium playback PWA. You can call it a PWA. If you call it a PWA, everyone will still understand you, but if you call it a PWA, nobody will understand you. So don't do that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the state of offline technology on the web and Shaka's particular strategy for this, which we'd recommend to anybody, whether you're using Shaka Player or not. Lessons we've learned over the course of Shaka's history. I'm going to try to go quickly. I know it's late. So first of all, what is a PWA? If you're not familiar, a progressive web app doesn't tell you what it actually is. What it actually is a fast offline web app without the whole browser UI. That's really all it is. It encompasses a certain set of technologies that get you to that goal, but the goal is you don't want it to look like a web app. You want it to look and feel like a native app, but it's still running in a browser. You just don't see the URL bar. You don't see all the other browser UI. This is composed of three main things. There's the app manifest, and the service worker, and an HTTPS origin, because why are you not using HTTPS? The number of bug reports I get with HTTP manifest URLs still shocks me. But PWAs are very, very simple. It sounds complicated when you look at some of the docs on MDN or you look at tutorials, but it is really just these three things. An application manifest is very simple. It has the title of your application, some background color, and a logo. That's it. You really don't have to do anything else. You put those things in JSON, you're done. That's one whole section of your PWA done. Service worker is a little bit more involved, but this minimal service worker has exactly one job, and that is to make sure that every asset necessary for your application to run is available offline. When the service worker is installed by your application, it goes out, it grabs all the absolutely critical resources, puts them into cache, and they're there whether you're online or not. So completely independent of anything else, if you have a service worker, you have your application cached, even if you don't have any other part of the PWA equation, you can go into airplane mode, go to that same URL in your browser, and it will load. Even though it still looks like a web app, it still is a web app, that's all the service worker has to do, and you really don't have to make it more complicated than that. One of the things the service worker does is it intercepts, fetches, or has the opportunity to intercept any XHR or fetch that your application performs and can serve that request from the cache. You can also ignore requests you don't want to handle, and those go through the normal path in the browser. So how is premium media different? Premium media offline is, in my opinion, separate from a PWA. You don't have to have a PWA to do offline media, and you don't have to have offline media to have a PWA, obviously. So Shaka Player had offline media support long before PWAs existed, because the necessary pieces of that is EME, the persistent license session type to be able to get that license while you're offline, and somewhere to store media segments. Having your application offline can be thought of as completely separate from having your media offline. And in my opinion, it's really advantageous to do it that way. Are PWAs ready? If you're thinking about a PWA, or you are, maybe I've convinced you that it's not as hard as it sounds, you have to be the judge for your use case if PWAs are ready for your application. But this is the state of the web as of October. Service workers and cache API supported across all four major browsers as of Safari 12, or I think maybe 11.3. The web app manifest, what that gets you is that nice little button that says, hey, do you want to add this to your home screen, your desktop, your whatever. Those are available in Chrome, Firefox on Android, Edge, and Safari has, Apple has listed that as a work in progress, in development on webkit.org. EME is available everywhere, with the exception that for Safari you have to use their native HLS implementation. You can't use media source and EME together on Safari yet. Maybe if more people request it, they might change that. And then the bottom half of that is the premium media part, EME and persistent license. Persistent license session type is available on Edge with their new key system ID. That was a thing we didn't realize for quite some time, and we have not added to Shaka Player yet. Firefox, for some reason, does not have persistent license type, even though they're using the Widevine CDM, same as Chrome. And then Chrome on Linux does not have persistent license because of content security concerns. The mechanisms that keep that offline license secure have not been implemented on Linux and are quite a bit more challenging to implement on Linux than Mac or Windows or Android or Chrome OS. For Safari, there's kind of a question mark there. Do they have persistent license session type? I'm guessing no, but we don't support Fair Play yet in Shaka Player, so we haven't had the opportunity to figure that out yet. At the bottom here, you've got some market share numbers. These are from one particular source of data. If you have spent any time looking at browser market share, no two data sources even come close to agreeing on that. The first numbers that I pulled had Safari mobile at something like 10 to 20%. I went to another data source so that I wouldn't have to rescale the numbers, and that number jumped to 53. So it all depends on who's collecting the data, but if you're considering a PWA, these are the numbers you want to look at to decide if you're going to be able to hit all of your target audiences. So,
and how you define share.
And how you define share, yeah, exactly. So some data to consider, but premium media in PWAs. One of the things about a PWA is your service worker gets to cache assets, gets to cache resources. So you're probably thinking, let's just do that with media. I strongly recommend not to do that. You can technically cache your media segments in the Cache API. Shaka Player chooses not to do that. Experience taught us that that was not going to be a viable way to do it. And in fact, there are some PWA samples out there that take this approach, and the workarounds they had to add to work around all the problems that came with that were significant. So one of the things about storing media offline is you have this dash or HLS manifest. It's adaptive bit rate. It has multiple bit rates and resolutions. You don't need any of that offline. Why would you cache the whole thing? The manifest describes all of those things. So if you cache that manifest, now you have this offline manifest that refers to all of the different resolutions and bit rates, and you probably, if you were smart, you only cached one resolution, one bit rate. So now you go try to play that thing offline, your player loads the exact same manifest, starts trying to do adaptation, especially if those segments are coming really fast from your cache. Then you start trying to adapt to things that are not available offline. So working around that requires a very tight coupling between your service worker and your application. What we did in Shaka Player is completely different. We store our segments and whatever metadata is required into IndexedDB instead of the Cache API. We chose IndexedDB because it was, at the time, and still is, the only cross-browser way to store large amounts of data. There's other APIs for storing large amounts of data that are only available on one browser and are deprecated and not standardized. There are other cross-browser APIs that only allow small amounts of data. We don't really need a database per se, but IndexedDB was the only game in town. The stored metadata is equivalent to a subset of what was in the manifest, but we're storing the metadata specifically for the streams that we stored offline. So when it comes time to play back, we have exactly the metadata we need. We're not trying to extract it from a dash or HLS format. We just have the raw metadata in the database. And then everything is loaded from the database instead of being fetched from the network or from the Cache API through the service worker. So that's the approach we took. Even if you're not using Shaka Player, if you're going to go out and build this today for yourself, I highly recommend this approach over using the Cache API. You can make it work with the Cache API. In my opinion, it's way harder. So if you are interested in Shaka Player for a PWA, what's coming next is we're going to implement background fetch. This is a new feature that's coming in service workers and is already in Chrome, that you can ask the service worker to fetch content for you in the background. You could open your PWA, hit a button to store some particular content offline, close the app. That service worker is a separate thread of JavaScript. It's running independent of your window and your DOM. It can fetch that data for you, store it in the database, and it's available later for your user to play. In fact, in Android, it will even show you progress in notification while that's happening in the background. So we'll be adding support for that. And we're also going to add library functions to simplify your service worker setup, because the downside of a service worker is you get one per application. So if I wrote your whole service worker for you in Shaka Player and said, install the official Shaka Player service worker, you would have no way to add anything custom for your application without forking Shaka Player. We don't want that. You don't want that. What we have today is an example that you can draw from, but we'd really like to make it as simple as loading a library, calling a method, and then adding whatever application special sauce you need. So hopefully we'll be able to make that easier for people who do choose to use Shaka Player in their applications. And that is it. So if anybody has any questions, yes? I'll wait for the mic, sorry.
I'm excited to hear that Android notifications support the background. So that opens the elephant in the room question. We have this lovely chart which shows all these different browsers and platforms supporting it. And what about all the darn TV sets that aren't necessarily using any of those? Like, let's start with yours, Chromecast. Can I do a PWA that works in a Chromecast device?
Chromecasts don't have their own storage for media. They don't work offline.
Oh.
And as far as I know, there aren't any situations where you would need to take your TV offline. Watch content on your TV in an airplane doesn't really seem like a use case. So no, I don't see any of this coming to TVs or Chromecast, but primarily these offline playback scenarios would be for mobile devices. Although everything that's been described here also works on desktops, at least in the Chrome column and in the Edge column, works on desktops. So for desktops or laptops, laptop is also a good offline scenario, especially for travel. And on mobile devices, I think this set of technologies makes a lot of sense.
But not the universal app solution for OTT appliances.
Well, I think by nature, an OTT appliance needs to be connected, right?
Okay.
So, yeah, I'm not sure. But the rest of the web app would certainly work in an OTT appliance. This is the progressive part of Progressive Web App, is that any of these things that are not available on the platform don't hamper the functionality of the rest of the application. So, for example, the Shaka Player demo today is already a PWA. You can install it onto your home screen on Android or on Chrome OS. I've got it here on mine. And if you were to load that same demo on a Tizen television, the demo still works fine. You don't get any of the offline functionality, but you really weren't looking for it. And we didn't write two applications, one for offline, one for online, one for web, one for mobile. It's one universal application. So yes, you do get the universal application out of it, but offline doesn't really factor into that.
Thanks.
Uh-huh.
So how recently did the offline get added to Shaka Player?
Offline was added to Shaka Player, I would have to look up an exact date. It was multiple years ago.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
are a lot of people using the approach that you've created for offline storage? Are you aware of? I mean, I would need to know individual companies, but I mean, just
Sure.
Are you getting feedback on the approach with
We-
IndexedDB?
We've had a lot of feedback on GitHub about some particulars of the API, so people are using it. The problem with an open source project in general is that nobody has to tell us they're using it. So some of our biggest customers we didn't know about for a year until they really needed something and decided to tell us who they were. So I think it's the same with offline. We don't know exactly who's using it.
Sure.
There seems to be some interest. When we first implemented offline media support in Shaka Player, the only platform that had EME persistent license support was Chrome OS. So the great thing about web APIs and web standards is we wrote it once, we tested it on the very first platform that had that feature, and when persistent license got added to Android, we literally changed nothing. And when it came out on desktop platforms, we changed nothing. We wrote to the standard, and new platforms came online, and it just worked. We have yet to implement the new PlayReady key system ID in Shaka Player,
Yeah.
when we do, I fully expect it will just work because standards.
Standard.
So-
So I have one other question about the Firefox.
Yeah.
We're on this slide.
Uh-huh.
So they use Widevine,
Yes.
and they get a binary, I assume.
Mhm.
And so how is it that they? Do you have an idea as to why it only supports clear content offline?
I am not sure why persistent license was removed in Firefox. I discovered this fact while I was putting this slide together. So Firefox uses the same CDM that's in Chrome, the same binary, but beyond that, the layers that actually exist in the browser are independent of Chrome's source code completely. So
They just don't.
Ethical differences is probably the answer.
that's entirely possible. Firefox does support Widevine, they just don't support offline licensing, and I'm not sure why. I found a Bugzilla issue where they made the decision to remove it.
Do they
but
support persistent licenses?
They don't support persistent licenses at all. They do support Widevine, so you can watch premium content on Firefox when you're connected.
It's the persistent license.
It's the persistent license they removed,
Maybe concerned about fingerprinting or something like that.
It's possible, yeah. I'm not sure why they made that decision. They did remove it. I was unable to find a Bugzilla issue saying that they were going to add it back. But right now, they don't support it. The history on the issue said, in particular, if you asked the browser if they did support it, it said yes, and you tried to use it and it would fail. So when they removed it, it seemed like they were doing that for consistency's sake, but I'm not sure why it hasn't come back. So, yeah.
Any other questions for Joey? No. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great presentation.